In the busy port of Miami, where the ocean breeze mixed with the sounds of seagulls and rumbling trucks, a massive cruise ship was getting ready for its first-ever voyage. The excitement in the air was palpable. Passengers were lining up, eager, to board the luxurious vessel that promised adventure on the high seas. But behind the scenes, something troubling was brewing. Jonathan Reed, the CEO of Oceanic Cruises, stood near one of the loading docks, dressed like an ordinary worker. He wore faded jeans, scuffed boots, and a plain polo shirt. His usual expensive watch had been swapped for a cheap plastic one, and instead of his polished leather briefcase, he carried a beat-up clipboard. No one suspected that this unassuming man was actually their boss. Jonathan wasn't there just to observe. He was undercover because alarming reports had reached his desk. Customers were complaining left and right about damaged luggage, missing items, and general chaos when it came to handling suitcases at the dock. For a company known for luxury and customer satisfaction, these complaints were unacceptable. Instead of sending out memos or delegating someone else to investigate, Jonathan decided to take matters into his own hands. He wanted to see what was really going on and fix it himself if necessary. Walking onto the dock, Jonathan introduced himself as John, a temporary worker hired to help during the busy season. The real workers didn't question him much. After all, the docks were always short-staffed, especially before big departures. They handed him a pair of gloves and pointed him toward a mountain of suitcases waiting to be loaded onto the ship. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Conveyor belts hummed as they carried bags from carts to sorting stations. Workers shouted instructions over the noise, directing others to specific piles based on cabin numbers. It looked organized enough, but then Jonathan noticed something that made his stomach churn. A burly supervisor, who everyone called Rick, was tossing heavy suitcases onto a cart like they weighed nothing. One particularly large bag marked with a bright red fragile sticker landed with a loud thud, causing some of the other workers to wince. "Hey, watch it!" Rick barked at another worker nearby, not even acknowledging the damage he might have caused. Jonathan froze, watching silently. He imagined fragile souvenirs shattering inside that suitcase, or worse, expensive electronics being crushed. This wasn't how things were supposed to work. As the CEO, he prided himself on offering top-notch service. Yet here was one of his supervisors treating customers' belongings with complete disregard. Curiosity got the better of Jonathan, so he approached a younger worker standing close by. "Does he always throw stuff around like that?" Jonathan asked casually, nodding toward Rick. The young man hesitated, glancing nervously at Rick before answering. "Yeah, but don't say anything. If you complain, he'll make your life hell." That response sent a chill down Jonathan's spine. Was fear really driving the way people worked here? He decided to dig deeper. Over the next few hours, he observed more closely. Rick wasn't alone in his behavior. Other team leads mimicked his actions, prioritizing speed over care. Some workers tried to handle things gently, but they were often pushed aside or mocked for being too slow. By lunchtime, Jonathan felt both frustrated and intrigued. How could such negligence go unnoticed? Didn't anyone speak up? To find answers, he joined a group of workers sitting under a makeshift tent for their break. They talked about everything from last night's football game to their plans for the weekend. But when the conversation turned to work, the mood shifted. "It's always like this," muttered one older worker, shaking his head. "They push us to move faster and faster, but no one cares if we mess up along the way." Another chimed in. "Yeah, and if you try to tell them something's wrong, they act like it's your fault. I've seen good people quit because of this place." Jonathan listened intently, letting the pieces fall into place. These weren't lazy workers. They were trapped in a system that rewarded recklessness. And while Rick might have been the face of the problem, Jonathan knew the roots ran deeper. Somewhere along the line, the focus had shifted from quality to quantity, and now customers were paying the price. As the day wore on, Jonathan kept working alongside the crew, learning the ins and outs of the operation. Despite the challenges, he couldn't help but admire the dedication of some of the workers. Even under pressure, many still tried their best to do the right thing. One woman in particular caught his eye. She handled every suitcase with care, double-checking tags and making sure nothing fragile ended up at the bottom of the pile. When the shift finally ended, Jonathan walked back to his car feeling exhausted but determined. What he'd witnessed today was unacceptable, but it wasn't unsolvable. Tomorrow he would continue his investigation, hoping to uncover more truths hidden beneath the surface. Little did he know, what lay ahead would test not only his leadership skills but also his ability to empathize with those working tirelessly behind the scenes. The next morning, Jonathan returned to the dock feeling a mix of determination and unease. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the water and giving the port an almost peaceful vibe. But as soon as he stepped onto the loading area, the calm disappeared. Trucks rumbled in with fresh deliveries, workers shouted instructions, and the conveyor belts groaned under the weight of countless suitcases. It was chaos, but organized chaos, or so it seemed on the surface. Jonathan had spent the night replaying everything he'd seen the day before. The careless way Rick handled luggage stuck in his mind like a bad dream. He couldn't shake the image of that fragile suitcase hitting the cart with a thud. What if someone's wedding dress got torn? Or their child's favorite toy broke beyond repair? These weren't just bags, they were pieces of people's lives. And yet here at the dock, they were treated like disposable cargo. As he clocked in for another shift, Jonathan decided to focus on understanding why things were the way they were. Was it really just about speed? Or was there something deeper driving this behavior? To get answers, he started paying closer attention to how different workers interacted, not just with the luggage, but with each other. Rick was easy to spot. He strutted around like he owned the place, barking orders and occasionally grabbing suitcases himself to demonstrate how it should be done. His method was brutal. Grab, lift, toss. No finesse, no care. When one worker hesitated after seeing a delicate-looking bag, Rick rolled his eyes. "Come on, we don't have all day," he snapped, snatching the suitcase away and hurling it onto the pile. The worker flinched, but didn't say a word. Watching this unfold made Jonathan's blood boil, but instead of confronting Rick directly, which would blow his cover, he decided to talk to some of the quieter workers during breaks. That's when he met a middle-aged woman who worked tirelessly despite the pressure. She moved slower than most, carefully placing each bag where it belonged. Her name tag read Maria, though she never mentioned it herself. During a lull in the action, Jonathan struck up a conversation with her. "You've been doing this a while, huh?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Maria nodded, wiping sweat from her brow. "Long enough to know what works and what doesn't," she replied. There was a weariness in her voice, but also pride. "I used to love this job, helping people start their vacations right. It felt important, you know?" Jonathan nodded, encouraging her to continue. "But lately," Maria sighed, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no supervisors were listening. "It's not the same anymore. They keep pushing us harder and harder. Speed is all that matters now. If you take your time, they yell at you. Or worse, write you up." This revelation hit Jonathan hard. For years, he'd emphasized efficiency in every department, believing it would improve customer satisfaction and boost profits. Now, standing there in his disguise, he realized the unintended consequences of those decisions. By focusing solely on speed, he'd created a culture where quality suffered, and where good employees like Maria felt powerless to speak up. Later that afternoon, Jonathan witnessed another incident that drove the point home. A new hire, clearly overwhelmed by the fast pace, accidentally dropped a heavy suitcase. Before anyone could react, Rick stormed over, his face red with anger. "What's wrong with you?" he barked, pointing a finger inches from the young man's face. "If you can't handle this, maybe you shouldn't be here." The new worker stammered an apology, visibly shaken. Nearby, others watched silently, pretending not to notice. Jonathan clenched his fists inside his gloves, resisting the urge to step in. Instead, he filed the moment away in his memory, adding it to the growing list of issues he planned to address once his undercover mission ended. By the end of the day, Jonathan's body ached from lifting bags and running back and forth between carts. But it was his mind that felt the heaviest. He thought about Maria's words and the fear he saw in the eyes of the newer workers. This wasn't just a logistical problem. It was a human one. People were scared. Scared of making mistakes, scared of speaking out, scared of losing their jobs. That night, as he sat alone in his hotel room, Jonathan pulled out the notebook he'd brought along. He jotted down notes about everything he'd observed: the reckless tossing of luggage, the toxic leadership style of supervisors like Rick, and the quiet desperation of workers caught in the middle. He also wrote down ideas for solutions. Things like better training programs, clearer guidelines for handling fragile items, and ways to empower employees to report problems without fear of retaliation. But even as he brainstormed 过去的内容似乎被意外截断了，让我继续完成这段故事的扩展。But even as he brainstormed solutions, Jonathan knew the hardest part was still ahead. Fixing the system wouldn't be easy, especially when it involved challenging people in positions of power, like Rick. Still, he reminded himself why he was doing this. Every suitcase represented a passenger's trust in oceanic cruises. If that trust was broken, the entire business suffered. The next morning, Jonathan arrived at the dock early, determined to gather more insights. He wanted to see if the issues he'd noticed were isolated incidents or part of a larger pattern. As the day unfolded, he paid close attention to how different teams operated. Some groups worked seamlessly, communicating effectively and supporting each other. Others, however, mirrored the chaos he'd seen under Rick's supervision. It became clear that leadership, or lack thereof, played a huge role in shaping the work environment. One particularly telling moment came when a group of workers struggled to load a bulky piece of luggage onto a cart. Two of them tried lifting it together, but it was too heavy. Just as frustration started to build, Maria stepped in. "Here, let me show you," she said calmly. With minimal effort, she guided them on how to balance the weight properly, turning what could have been a stressful situation into a teachable moment. The younger workers thanked her, and for a brief moment the tension eased. Jonathan watched silently, impressed by Maria's ability to lead without authority. She wasn't a supervisor, yet her actions inspired respect and cooperation. It made him wonder, what if the company promoted people like her instead of individuals like Rick? Would that change the culture entirely? As the hours ticked by, Jonathan continued observing, learning, and documenting. Each interaction gave him a clearer picture of the challenges facing the team and the opportunities for improvement. He began to feel a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about fixing a broken process. It was about creating a workplace where everyone could thrive. By the time his second day ended, Jonathan was physically exhausted, but mentally energized. He knew he had a long road ahead, but he also knew he was on the right path. For the first time in a long time, he felt connected to the heart of his company, not through spreadsheets or boardroom meetings, but through the people who kept it running, and deep down he vowed to make things right, not just for the passengers waiting to board their dream vacations, but for the hard-working men and women who deserved better than what they'd been given. By the third day, Jonathan was starting to feel like part of the crew. The other workers no longer gave him curious glances or asked too many questions about who he was or why he was there. He blended in, just another pair of hands helping load luggage onto the cruise ship. But while he might have looked like everyone else, his mind was racing with thoughts and observations. Every careless toss of a suitcase, every frustrated sigh from a worker, and every shout from a supervisor added to the growing picture he was piecing together. That morning, the dock was busier than usual. A second cruise liner had pulled in unexpectedly, doubling the workload for the team. Trucks lined up bumper to bumper, unloading mountains of bags that needed to be sorted and loaded quickly. The pressure was palpable, and it showed in how people worked or didn't work well together. Rick, predictably, was at the center of the storm. He paced back and forth like a drill sergeant, barking orders and pointing fingers. "Faster! Move it!" he yelled at anyone within earshot. When one worker hesitated after seeing a particularly heavy bag marked "Handle with care," Rick grabbed it himself and threw it onto the cart without a second thought. The loud thud echoed across the dock, drawing groans from nearby workers. Jonathan winced as he watched the scene unfold. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of message this sent to the rest of the team. If someone in charge acted like carelessness was acceptable, then why would anyone else bother being careful? It wasn't just about damaging luggage, it was about setting a standard. And right now, that standard was dangerously low. Later that afternoon, Jonathan found himself working alongside Maria again. She moved with precision, her hands steady as she placed each suitcase exactly where it needed to go. Unlike others, she didn't rush, even when Rick shouted for everyone to pick up the pace. Her calm demeanor seemed almost defiant in the face of the chaos around her. "Why do you put up with this?" Jonathan asked during a brief lull. They were standing near a stack of bags, catching their breath before diving back into the fray. Maria shrugged, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "It's not about putting up with it," she said quietly. "It's about doing my job the way I know it should be done. I can't control what they do, but I can control what I do." Her words struck a chord with Jonathan. Here was someone who refused to let negativity dictate her actions, a beacon of integrity in an otherwise chaotic environment. But her quiet strength also highlighted the frustration simmering beneath the surface. Why should someone like Maria have to fight so hard to do things the right way? As the day wore on, Jonathan began noticing cracks in the foundation of the operation. The more overwhelmed the workers became, the sloppier their handling of luggage got. New hires in particular struggled to keep up. One young man accidentally dropped a suitcase, spilling its contents onto the ground. Clothes, toiletries, and electronics scattered everywhere. Before he could apologize, Rick was on him like a hawk. "What's wrong with you?" Rick growled, kicking the spilled items out of his path. "Pick that up and get moving." The young worker scrambled to gather everything, his face flushed with embarrassment. Nearby, other workers pretended not to notice, focusing instead on their own tasks. Jonathan clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to step in. He reminded himself that blowing his cover wouldn't help anyone, but it didn't make watching the scene any easier. During a short break later that day, Jonathan sat with a group of workers under a shaded area. They talked about everything, from the weather to their plans for the weekend. But eventually, the conversation turned back to work. One older worker shook his head as he sipped his coffee. "This place used to be different," he muttered. "We had time to do things properly. Now it's all about speed, speed, speed. Doesn't matter if we mess up as long as we're fast." Another chimed in, nodding grimly. "Yeah, and the worst part is, no one listens when you try to say something. You either keep quiet or get written up." Jonathan listened intently, letting their frustrations wash over him. What they described wasn't just poor management. It was a culture of fear. Workers weren't speaking up because they didn't feel safe doing so. Supervisors like Rick ruled through intimidation, creating an environment where mistakes went unreported and problems festered unchecked. After the break, Jonathan returned to work with renewed determination. He wanted to see if the issues he'd observed were consistent throughout the operation or specific to certain areas. As he moved between loading zones, he noticed subtle differences in how teams functioned. Some groups worked seamlessly, communicating effectively and supporting each other. Others mirrored the chaos he'd seen under Rick's watchful eye. One particularly striking example came when two workers argued over whose responsibility it was to move a large trunk. Voices rose, tempers flared, and for a moment it looked like things might escalate further. Just as Jonathan considered stepping in, Maria appeared. Without raising her voice, she calmly suggested a solution. "Let's both grab it. On 3, okay?" The argument dissolved instantly, replaced by cooperation. Together, the three of them lifted the trunk and placed it securely on the cart. It was a small moment, but it spoke volumes about the power of leadership, even informal leadership, to diffuse tension and foster teamwork. As the sun began to set, marking the end of another grueling day, Jonathan felt a mix of emotions. Exhaustion weighed heavily on his shoulders, but so did hope. For every problem he'd identified, he'd also seen glimpses of potential. Workers like Maria proved that change was possible, if given the right tools and support. That night, back in his hotel room, Jonathan reflected on everything he'd learned. He thought about the workers' stories, the reckless behavior of supervisors, and the silent struggles of those trying to do their best despite the odds. He realized that fixing the luggage operation wasn't just about implementing new policies. It was about rebuilding trust. Trust between employees and supervisors, trust between workers and the company, and ultimately, trust between the company and its customers. With a pen in hand, he jotted down more notes in his notebook. Ideas flowed freely now, ways to improve training, methods to encourage open communication, and strategies to reward quality over quantity. Each idea represented a step toward a better future, not just for oceanic cruises but for the people who made it run. As he closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair, Jonathan allowed himself a small smile. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. Ready to listen, to learn, and to lead. Because sometimes the most important changes start not with grand gestures, but with simple acts of understanding and the courage to do what's right. By the fourth day, Jonathan was no longer just blending in. He was fully immersed in the rhythm of the dock. The early morning hustle felt almost familiar now, as did the constant hum of activity around him. Yet, despite growing accustomed to the environment, he couldn't ignore the mounting tension that seemed to grow with each passing hour. The pressure on the workers was relentless, and it showed in their strained expressions and hurried movements. That morning, a new twist added fuel to the fire, an unexpected delay caused by a mechanical issue with one of the conveyor belts. Bags began piling up faster than anyone could sort them, creating bottlenecks at every turn. Workers scrambled to keep up, but the stress was evident. Voices rose louder, tempers flared quicker, and mistakes became more frequent. Rick, true to form, responded to the chaos by yelling even more than usual. "Come on, people, we don't have all day," he barked, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. His tone was sharp, his patience non-existent. When a worker hesitated after seeing a bag marked fragile, Rick didn't hesitate to snatch it away and toss it onto the cart himself. The loud thud echoed through the air, drawing groans from those nearby. Jonathan gritted his teeth but stayed focused on his task. He knew snapping at Rick wouldn't solve anything, not when he was undercover, and certainly not when doing so would only add to the toxic atmosphere. Instead, he channeled his frustration into observation. Every careless action, every muttered complaint, and every resigned sigh gave him more insight into the cracks in the system. Later that afternoon, things took a turn for the worse. A passenger stormed onto the dock, visibly upset. She carried a broken laptop in her hands, its screen cracked beyond repair. "This is unacceptable," she shouted, pointing accusingly at the luggage pile. Her voice carried over the noise, silencing everyone within earshot. Rick stepped forward, arms crossed. "Ma'am, I assure you this isn't our fault," he said, dismissively. "These things happen during travel. Maybe check your warranty?" The woman's face turned red with anger. "Are you kidding me? This was labeled fragile. How hard is it to handle something carefully?" The argument escalated quickly, with Rick refusing to take responsibility, and the passenger growing increasingly irate. Security eventually intervened, escorting the woman away while Rick shrugged off the incident as if it were nothing. Jonathan watched silently, his stomach sinking. This wasn't just a one-off mistake, it was symptomatic of a much larger problem. After the commotion died down, Jonathan noticed something troubling. New hires, overwhelmed by the workload and intimidated by Rick's behavior, had started mimicking his reckless habits. One young worker, clearly struggling under the weight of a heavy suitcase, threw it onto the pile without a second thought. Another followed suit, tossing another bag carelessly. The cycle of negligence was spreading, infecting even those who might have otherwise handled things with care. That evening, during a rare, quiet moment, Jonathan approached Maria. She was sitting on a bench near the loading area, sipping water and staring out at the ocean. He sat down beside her, careful not to interrupt her thoughts. "You okay?" he asked gently. She sighed, shaking her head. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she admitted. "It's not just the work. It's the way they treat us. Like we're disposable. And the worst part is we're treating the passengers' stuff the same way." Her words hit Jonathan hard. For years, he'd prided himself on running a company that prioritized customer satisfaction. But here, hidden beneath layers of mismanagement and neglect, was proof that his vision had gone awry. Passengers weren't being treated as valued guests. Their belongings were being treated as obstacles to overcome. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dock, Jonathan made a decision. He couldn't wait until the end of his undercover stint to start making changes. The issues were too urgent, too pervasive. If he wanted to fix the culture, he needed evidence, solid proof that would convince even the most skeptical executives back at headquarters. Over the next few days, Jonathan worked tirelessly to gather that evidence. During shifts, he discreetly used his phone to record instances of mishandling. He noted timestamps, descriptions, and the individuals involved, ensuring he had a detailed account of each incident. He also conducted informal interviews with workers, assuring them their identities would remain anonymous. Their stories painted a damning picture of negligence fueled by fear and poor leadership. One worker described how supervisors routinely ignored complaints about damaged luggage, blaming manufacturers instead of addressing the root cause. Another recounted being reprimanded for taking extra time to secure a fragile item properly. Each story added weight to Jonathan's growing file, reinforcing the need for immediate action. On his final day undercover, Jonathan arrived at the dock with a mix of relief and determination. He had seen enough and heard enough to know exactly what needed to change. As he loaded the last suitcase onto the ship, he took a moment to look around. The workers moved mechanically, their faces etched with exhaustion. Some glanced at the departing cruise liner wistfully, perhaps imagining themselves aboard, far away from the stress and pressure. That night, back in his hotel room, Jonathan reviewed everything he'd collected. The videos, the notes, the testimonials, it all told the same story. A story of systemic failure where speed had been prioritized over care, and fear had silenced those who dared to speak up. But buried within that story was also hope. Hope that change was possible and that the workers deserved better, not just for their sake, but for the sake of the company and its customers. With a deep breath, Jonathan closed his notebook and stood up. Tomorrow he would return to headquarters, ready to confront the issues head-on. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew it was necessary, because sometimes the hardest battles are worth fighting, not for glory or recognition, but because they're the right thing to do. And as he stared out the window at the glittering lights of Miami, Jonathan felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning, Jonathan walked into the boardroom at Oceanic Cruises headquarters with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Gone was the faded polo shirt and scuffed boots. Instead, he wore his usual sharp suit, exuding confidence and authority. But beneath the polished exterior lay the weight of everything he'd witnessed on the dock. He carried a folder filled with notes, videos, and testimonials, the evidence he'd gathered during his undercover stint. Today, he planned to confront the issues head-on. The room was already buzzing with senior executives when he entered. They exchanged polite greetings, unaware of the storm about to hit. Jonathan took his seat at the head of the table, placing the folder in front of him. For a moment, he simply looked around the room, studying their faces. These were the people responsible for shaping company policies, yet many had no idea what life was really like for the workers on the ground. It was time to change that. "Thank you all for coming," Jonathan began, his tone calm but firm. "I've called this meeting because we have a serious problem. A problem that's affecting both our employees and our customers. And before we discuss solutions, I want to show you exactly what's been happening behind the scenes." With that, he opened the folder and began presenting his findings. He played video clips showing supervisors carelessly tossing luggage onto carts, ignoring fragile stickers and warnings. He shared stories from workers who described the fear they felt every day: fear of speaking up, fear of making mistakes, fear of retaliation. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of a system broken by misaligned priorities and toxic leadership. The room fell silent as the executives watched and listened. Some looked shocked, others uncomfortable. A few shifted in their seats, clearly uneasy about what they were seeing. When the presentation ended, Jonathan leaned forward, his gaze steady. "This isn't just about damaged luggage," he said. "It's about trust. Our passengers trust us to take care of their belongings, and right now we're failing them. But more importantly, our employees are losing faith in us. They're scared to speak up because they don't believe anyone will listen. That has to change." One executive cleared his throat nervously. "So, what do you propose we do about it?" he asked. Jonathan didn't hesitate. "First, we hold accountable those who've contributed to this culture. Starting today, Rick and several other supervisors are suspended pending further investigation. Their behavior is unacceptable, and it sets the wrong example for everyone else." A murmur rippled through the room, but Jonathan pressed on. "Second, we overhaul the entire process. Speed can't be our only priority anymore. We need comprehensive training programs that emphasize quality over quantity. Every worker should know how to handle luggage properly and feel empowered to report issues without fear of backlash." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Third, we establish anonymous feedback channels for employees. If someone sees something wrong, they need a safe way to tell us about it. And finally, we reward good behavior. Instead of bonuses based solely on speed, let's recognize teams that consistently deliver high-quality work. Let's make it clear that doing things the right way matters more than cutting corners." The executives nodded slowly, processing his suggestions. While some seemed hesitant, others appeared genuinely moved by the presentation. One woman spoke up, her voice thoughtful. "This is going to take time and resources. Are you sure we can afford it?" Jonathan met her gaze directly. "What we can't afford is to keep losing customers and alienating our workforce. This isn't just an investment in logistics. It's an investment in people. And if we don't act now, the cost will be far greater down the line." By the end of the meeting, there was a consensus. Changes needed to happen, and quickly. Jonathan left the boardroom feeling a mix of relief and determination. The hardest part was over. He'd exposed the truth and secured buy-in from leadership. Now came the real challenge: implementing the changes and proving to everyone involved that this wasn't just another empty promise. Over the following weeks, Jonathan threw himself into the transformation process. He started by visiting the dock again, this time openly as CEO. Workers greeted him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Many had heard rumors about the shakeup, but weren't sure what to expect. Jonathan wasted no time addressing their concerns. Standing on a makeshift platform near the loading area, he addressed the team. "I know there's been a lot of frustration here," he began, his voice carrying across the space. "And I want you to know that I see it. I hear you. What's been happening isn't okay, and it stops now." He went on to outline the new initiatives: better training, improved communication channels, and a renewed focus on quality. He also announced the suspension of the problematic supervisors and introduced temporary replacements committed to fostering a positive work environment. "We're not perfect," Jonathan admitted, "but we're working towards something better, for you, for our passengers, and for this company. Together, we can make that happen." As he spoke, he noticed subtle shifts in body language. Some workers nodded approvingly while others exchanged hopeful glances. Maria, the meticulous worker who had inspired him so much, approached him after the speech. "I hope you mean what you say," she said quietly, her expression guarded but sincere. "We've heard promises before." Jonathan met her gaze, unwavering. "I do, and I'll prove it to you, one step at a time." True to his word, Jonathan stayed involved in the rollout of the new policies. He visited the dock regularly, checking in with workers and supervisors alike. Slowly but surely, things began to improve. Training sessions taught employees proper handling techniques, emphasizing care over haste. Anonymous feedback forms allowed workers to voice concerns without fear of repercussions, and recognition programs rewarded teams that excelled in both efficiency and quality. Months later, the impact of these changes became undeniable. Passenger complaints plummeted, replaced by glowing reviews praising the professionalism of the ground crew. Employees reported feeling more valued and supported, leading to higher morale and lower turnover rates. Even the atmosphere at the dock felt lighter, with laughter and camaraderie replacing tension and resentment. For Jonathan, the journey had been transformative, not just for the company, but for himself. Going undercover had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his leadership style and the culture he'd helped create. It had reminded him that businesses aren't built on profits alone. They're built on people. And when those people are treated with respect and given the tools to succeed, amazing things can happen. As he stood on the dock one evening, watching another cruise ship set sail under a sky painted with hues of orange and pink, Jonathan felt a deep sense of pride. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but for the first time in a long time, he felt confident that Oceanic Cruises was heading in the right direction. Months had passed since Jonathan's undercover mission at the dock, and the transformation was nothing short of remarkable. The once chaotic loading area now hummed with a sense of purpose and pride. Workers moved with care, treating each piece of luggage as if it belonged to someone they knew personally. Supervisors no longer barked orders but instead led by example, rolling up their sleeves to help when needed. It wasn't just a change in process, it was a shift in culture. One sunny morning, Jonathan returned to the dock, not as an undercover worker or even as a distant CEO, but as someone who genuinely wanted to connect with the people who made his company run. He walked among them casually, exchanging greetings and asking how things were going. There was a warmth in the air that hadn't existed before. People smiled more freely, laughed during breaks, and seemed genuinely invested in doing their best work. Maria, the meticulous worker who had inspired him so much, spotted him from across the dock. She waved and walked over, her face lighting up with a grin. "You kept your promise," she said simply, her tone filled with quiet satisfaction. Jonathan nodded, returning her smile. "Thanks to you, and everyone else here. You're the ones making this happen." Her words stayed with him throughout the day. As he observed the operation unfold, he couldn't help but notice the little moments that showed just how far they'd come. A new hire, unsure about where to place a fragile bag, asked for guidance rather than guessing. An experienced worker stepped in immediately, showing them the proper technique. Nearby, another team worked together seamlessly, lifting heavier items without hesitation or frustration. These small acts of teamwork and care spoke volumes about the changes taking place. Later that afternoon, Jonathan joined a group of workers under the shade of a tent for their lunch break. They welcomed him warmly, pulling up a chair and offering him a sandwich. For the first time in years, he felt like part of the team, not because of his title, but because of the shared effort to create something better. The conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from weekend plans to favorite cruise destinations, but eventually it turned back to work. One older worker leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Things are different now," he said. "It's not perfect, but it feels fairer, like we actually matter." Another chimed in, nodding enthusiastically. "Yeah, and passengers are happier too. Last week, a lady came back to thank us for handling her stuff so carefully, said it made her vacation stress-free. That never happened before." Jonathan listened intently, letting their words sink in. This was what success looked like, not numbers on a spreadsheet, but real human connections. Employees felt valued, customers felt respected, and the entire operation ran smoother as a result. It was proof that leadership wasn't just about giving orders. It was about listening, learning, and leading with empathy. As the day wound down, Jonathan took a moment to stand by the water's edge, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The golden light danced on the waves, casting long shadows across the dock. Behind him, the sounds of laughter and camaraderie filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension and fear that had once dominated the space. He thought back to the beginning of this journey. The frustration, the anger, the uncertainty. At times it had felt overwhelming, like trying to turn around a ship mid-ocean. But step by step, decision by decision, they had done it. And while there was still room for improvement, the progress was undeniable. That evening, Jonathan attended a town hall meeting with employees from all departments, not just the dock workers. Standing at the front of the room, he looked out at the sea of faces before him. Some were familiar, others new, but all shared one thing in common. They were part of the Oceanic Cruises family. "I want to start by saying thank you," he began, his voice steady but heartfelt. "Thank you for speaking up when things weren't right. Thank you for sticking with us through tough times, and most importantly, thank you for believing in the possibility of change." The room erupted into applause, and Jonathan paused, letting the moment settle. When the clapping died down, he continued, "This isn't my victory, it's ours. Together, we've proven that a company can be successful without sacrificing its values. We've shown that treating people with respect, whether they're passengers or employees, isn't just the right thing to do. It's the smart thing to do." He went on to highlight specific examples of how the changes had impacted both workers and customers. He praised Maria and others who had quietly led by example, refusing to compromise their standards even in the face of adversity. And he reiterated his commitment to keeping the momentum going, promising regular check-ins and ongoing improvements. By the end of the speech, the energy in the room was electric. Workers cheered, hugged each other, and shook hands with executives they had once viewed with suspicion. For the first time in a long time, there was a shared sense of ownership, a feeling that everyone played a role in shaping the future of the company. As Jonathan left the building later that night, he paused, outside the entrance looking up at the stars. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, and challenges would undoubtedly arise. But for now, he allowed himself to feel a deep sense of accomplishment. What started as a mission to fix a logistical problem had evolved into something far greater, a renewed understanding of what it meant to lead with heart. By putting people first, Jonathan had not only salvaged trust but also reignited passion within the organization. Oceanic Cruises wasn't just a business anymore, it was a community. And as the sound of distant waves mingled with the hum of activity inside the port, Jonathan knew one thing for certain: the tide had turned. The company and the people behind it were finally sailing toward brighter horizons.